towards a socially inclusive environmental policy with Lucy Middlemas from Leeds and Caroline Snell from the University of York. And then 2 weeks later, on the 26th of June, we have Moira Wallace coming to talk to us about trends in adolescent disadvantage. So yes, there's information about those on the CASE website. So please sign up and come along in person or online. So my name's Laura Lane. I'm a policy officer here at CASE, and I'm organising the seminars this term with Kitty Stewart and Abigail McKnight, and also Jess Rowan, who's on online. So if you have any questions or clarifications needed for the online audience, please contact Jess and she can help with that. So just a bit of admin for those online, if you could remain muted throughout the presentation, but obviously feel free to write things in the chat. The presentation should last about 40 minutes and then we should have plenty of time for discussion. So yes, onto the presentation. Today we're delighted to welcome Dr. Adam Czerniak, who is Associate Professor at the Warsaw School of Economics and currently a professor here at LSE. So his recent research has explored the connection between housing inequality patterns and housing regimes in Europe, and today he's going to talk to us about the initial outcomes of these studies and possible potential future directions for the project. So over to you, Adam. Oh, and sorry, just let everyone know it's being recorded, just the presentation, but not the discussion. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with you. And I need, as it's recorded, I need to make a statement that I'm very grateful for the Civica Network for funding my visit here, short visit study. The purpose of my visit today and the presentation is to present you my research findings that we do in a team at the Warsaw School of Economics, to get your comments on that, because that's an ongoing research project, and also to show you what kind of angle housing inequality, housing affordability we do have in our part of Europe. Before I start presenting you our research findings, I would like to show you my inspiration for this research. So, oops.
Just click on the mouse. Yeah, great.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Laura. Okay, so inspiration number one is kind of an epiphany moment, at least for me, because when I was starting to do the research, thinking about the research on housing affordability, which is a very hot buzzword around Central and Eastern Europe at this moment, but I think it's all around here in Europe a problem. I read the Understanding Affordability book, and this quotes drove me. So at one level, at least in the private market, housing cannot be unaffordable. In aggregate, or the price of dwellings would simply fall. So for me, that was, as I said, an epiphany moment, as I understood that a vast bulk of the research we do on averages. So we look on average levels of prices, of incomes. We use different measures, but we look at averages, which to some extent blurs the picture. So to understand properly affordability and unaffordability, we need to look at inequality measures. We need to look at the dispersion of possibility to buy, to rent, to get a house from the state. The second inspiration, when I dig deeper into the methods we use to analyze inequality, was this slide. And you can come up with this data in various research, this data on housing inequality measured with net wealth inequality. Here we have with housing and without housing, and you can see, of course, that those inequality measures of wealth connected to housing are much higher than inequalities when it comes down to incomes. But then it's not about us, you know it most likely. But the thing that struck me here is that thing that's put in this red rectangles. So it's data for Poland and Germany. To give you a glimpse into my private life, these are the two countries that I lived in for a longer period. I said, okay, Germany having the highest wealth inequality with housing, and Poland has the lowest. Something was not fully correct for me. As I was living there, I did not feel that there were so many differences, that those countries are at the extremes of this dimension. And I was thinking, why might be so? Because I do believe in the data. It's hard data from the Household Finance and Consumer Survey from 2017. Very good prepared, very strong qualitative data on net wealth inequality. And then I realized a very special fact. The scale of commodification of housing in those countries and the financialization of housing in both countries. And from that starting point, I returned to my former research that I ended at the end of the last decade on housing regimes. Here I drew upon the findings of Schwartz and Seabrook on the varieties of residential capitalism. And together with a large team, we were working on comparative capitalism issues and how to put Central and Eastern Europe in the broader picture of diverse models of capitalism. I dealt with housing regimes, so the varieties of residential capitalism, and looked at we have a different adapted non-commodified model of housing regime. But the inspiration is that when we look at housing, we in fact look at very different regimes. And it's not just about the size and regulation of the rental market, different housing policies, the availability of mortgage loans, but also what is very important and which is a, let's say, so cornerstone notion in comparative capitalism, different kind of coordination mechanisms. So the way in which houses are traded, in which people do acquire the rights to own, to rent a house, to get a shelter in general. And here is my latest research. It's already in print. It should be printed each moment on housing allocation mechanisms across Europe. I took the very same data from the HFCS for 2017 and looked in a way how people do get their property right to use a house. And we have a vast difference between housing in the West and in the East, speaking generally, but you can find also some other dimensions here. What do you have on the slide? Here, the two blue parts of this graph indicate the purchase and renting of housing. So you can see that in Netherlands or in France or in Spain, 80% up to 90% of households bought or rented their house in the commercial market. But if you go to the east of the European Union, you see that here this share drops in case of Croatia to below 30%, Slovenia 33%, in Poland it's below 50%. So how do people get housing? They get it by a gift, inheritance, which is a very important part, and they construct it, they build it by their own. As I talked to Kath on Monday, she said, okay, almost no one is building a house here in the UK by themselves. That's totally different from what you do in Poland. If you have a piece of land, the thing that you would like to do on it is build my own home. And if you look at that, so you have the coordination mechanism, market coordination mechanism so low, then the measure of pure wealth inequality doesn't make that big sense anymore, because it's not about wealth. Many people do not know how much value they have in their house. For example, in the city of Warsaw, the capital of Poland, there are plenty of elderly people. They are living in flats that are worth 20, 50 times their monthly income. They have very low incomes and very high housing wealth. But they cannot do anything without it. There's no home equity withdrawal instruments for them, and they even do not think about valuation. They would like to live their lives to the end, their days to the end, and then give it as inheritance to their kids. That's how they envisage, as they see housing as a patrimony. So, starting from these three inspirations, I designed a research product that got funded by the National Science Center in Poland. It's called Housing Affordability in Diverse Models of Residential Capitalism. And it consists of 4 parts. 2 first parts already finished when it comes down to calculations. We are writing down the articles, we have the first drafts. Now we are doing research on the third part. I will show you some first findings. And then last but not least, we are willing to look at the impact of different housing policies in different kind of regimes. This was very important. But first of all, we need to get measures that shows us the housing affordability and in a broader inequality context. And we came up with 2 groups of measures. First, a flow-based approach to housing affordability, the so-called housing gap, which is based on the EU-SILC microdata, social income living conditions, and then a more stock-based approach to measuring inequality and housing affordability that's based on the HFCS, in the newer edition 2021. So this is also the outline of my presentation. So we'll start with presenting you the findings of the housing gap, then go to the housing stock distribution, and then I will show you some preliminary findings of the patterns which we see. So the housing gap, that's a notion that is already present in the literature, but we tried to operationalize it. The general definition of the housing gap that we use, also sometimes called the housing supply gap, but we dropped the supply word for evident reasons, as we'll see in a moment. We define the housing gap as the share of households. This is very important, not population, the share of households, on the base level of one of those households. The share of households in a given society that have incomes too low to buy or rent housing via the commercial market. So housing that is adequate to their housing needs. And at the very same time, they have too high incomes to get social housing and the kind of affordable housing schemes that are present in a given state. How do we operationalize that? So first of all, we need to make several assumptions. First assumption is on the minimum housing needs. That's of course disputable. In different parts of the world, you have different ideas of what a given type of household need in terms of space and number of rooms, but we based this table on the Eurostat notion of overcrowding, so the minimum number of rooms that a given household has, depending on the number of children and number of adults within a household. And then we translated those numbers of rooms into space in square meters. This is more a Central and Eastern Europe type of space, because if you go to Ireland, for example, they would assume 40 square meters for one person. It's quite a small space, but still, we were talking about minimums. So in this case, we use these numbers. Then we needed to define 3 more things. First, the overcrowding. That's the standard Eurostat definition of an overcrowded housing. I don't want to dig deeper into it. If you have questions, feel free to later on. Then we have the housing cost of a burden. Here, we use the measure of total housing costs as is provided in the EU-SILC microdata and is collected. And we use the threshold of 40% is also used by Eurostat. I know that there's a discussion whether it should be 40% or 25%. We have done some sensitivity analysis. We reduced that number to 25%, and of course the housing gap increased. Then but I won't dig deeper into that, as I would like to show you the broad picture, not the very detailed specifics of the whole measure. And then last but not least part of assumption is the so-called housing credit affordability. I introduced it already a couple of years ago when analyzing housing affordability, average levels of housing affordability across Central and Eastern Europe. And instead of using a pure price to rent ratio, I was introducing a method that takes into account the availability of housing loans in different countries, especially after the global financial crisis, when macroprudential regulations decreased the availability of credit to households, especially in our part of the world. In Poland, macroprudential regulations were very tough, which reduced the number of households that were eligible to get a credit. How is it calculated? For the purpose of calculating housing gap, we use two types of data. So the micro-level data from the EU-SILC on households' housing needs that I presented to you 2 slides ago, then the household's disposable income, and then 3 macro-level data. So average house prices in a given economy, average new housing loan interest rate, and macroprudential policy rules that apply in a given country. Of course, combining microdata with macro data is problematic, and I think that's one of the weakest points, to be frank, of this analysis. But then, when thinking about getting more detailed data, especially on average housing prices, means that we would need to narrow down our analysis to very small brackets of space. Yeah, so even London as a whole aggregate is not a feasible point of analysis, let's say. So we would need to disaggregate into different quarters or districts of big cities, which then we have problems with data on it. So on a national level, average house prices are quite available. And in a moment, you will see how I try to overcome this problem that we have combined macro level data, especially on house prices, with micro data. On the basis of those assumptions, we decided to introduce 7 household categories. So category A is covering those households that do not have any problems with overcrowding, or they are not overburdened, and they do not use any type of help from the state or from their families. So they are not within the rent below market or free rent part of the housing sector. Then we have category B, where there are households that have some issues with overcrowding and or they are overburdened by total housing costs. And at the very same time, they have to credit affordability to buy a house that satisfies their needs, that has housing costs lower than the given threshold, or is of a size that the very household needs. And this category is for us very important, as it tries to address the issue of unequal distribution of house prices. So, for example, of course, in this category might fall some households that under-consume housing. So that say, okay, I'm living on 40 square meters with 2 kids and my wife in school, but that's, in our opinion, and we'll see the data in a moment, that's a tiny share of the population. The majority of households that get into category B are those households that are living in big cities or in areas where the prices are very high and they need to under-consume the housing as they are forced by market. Or they do not have any housing opportunities to buy the house they need. For example, there is no supply of houses they need. Such problems we see in Bulgaria or Romania, in some part of Poland, especially in rural areas. So where people live in too big houses that pose too high total costs for them, but at the very same time, there is no availability of cheaper, smaller housing units in the surrounding area, and they don't want to move. So we think that B is also within the housing gap in sense largo. Then we have C, which is the strict housing gaps, households that live in overcrowded housing or are overburdened by housing costs. They do not have credit affordability and they are not helped by the state or family. And then we have category D, which is also for us very important, which states that there are also those households that are overcrowded or overburdened, do not have credit affordability, but at the very same time, they have some support. But the support is too small. So they are provided with social housing, but they get a social housing unit that's too small for their housing needs. And that's D. And then we have two other categories, E. So E is the category that gets support, and the support is sufficient. Then we have F. And here we have households that have credit affordability, but are still tenants with rent below market price. This can be both people that are using public housing, so owned by municipalities, or people that are using housing for their families. For example, students that are living in flats that are owned by their parents, so they need to pay any rent. They have great affordability, but still, if they can live in a house that's owned by their families and do not pay market rents, they are here in the category F. And then G are the others, so those with some missing data or any other combinations that are not stated above. And now to the findings. Here the countries are sorted by the size of the housing gap, with the biggest housing gap we found in Greece, smallest housing gap we found in Ireland. And as you see here, the housing gap is larger when you go to the east. However, there are some differences also among other countries. I'll show you a quick chart in a moment on that. But here I would like to point out two more things. First, the high variation of the B class regarding C class. So whether there are some structural problems, as I said, in Bulgaria, that's how we identified the B class in Bulgaria. But then we have also large B class in Croatia, where households are pushed out of the market, for example, by the investment in the tourist sector, which drives up house prices. And also if they're willing to live in their place of origin, for example, they are falling within the housing gap. But then second point here is category E. This is the share of households that get the appropriate help from the state or family. As you can see, or you cannot see, this is a very small part of the whole household structure, which struck me very much on the slide here. Here is a better picture when you look at time trends, because we use that data from 2010 to 2022. And here's the disaggregation into those four housing regimes that I discovered in the last decade, or identified in the last decade. So in the case of liberal corporatist models, so countries from northern part of Europe mostly, also Ireland, also the UK, it's rather stable. However, the last 2 years, so the housing boom of the last 2 years, post-pandemic housing boom, drove the housing gap to the highest level on this record, which is quite worrisome for me. And it was a fast increase when you look at the data. Then the most stable housing gap is in the status model countries, that's Switzerland, Germany, France, and Austria. It's very stable across time and also quite low. Then you have the commodified familial model, as I adopted, which is characteristic for mainly Mediterranean countries, so Greece, Portugal, Spain. And here we have seen increase in the housing gap, which according to my expert judgment, was the effect of the global financial crisis and the housing bust that lasted throughout 2013, 14, depending on the country. In some countries, it even lasted quite longer. Then the housing gap, together with the recovery, decreased. And last but not least, the non-commodified model of Central and Eastern Europe mainly, and also Italy falls in that bracket, which is quite interesting, sees a decrease in the housing gap. Yes?
Can you just explain the difference between a statist model and a non-commodified model?
The statist model, yeah, that's a good question, very good question. And to be frank, I would need to give a very long answer. But yeah, to give you main differences, let's say two main differences that are important for me. So in the non-commodified model, housing are treated mainly as a patrimony. So the familiar coordination mechanisms are very strong. In the statist model, the state coordination mechanisms are more stronger, but not in a corporatist way that the state engages directly in the market, but more it engages in market mechanisms. So rent regulation is high, tenant regulation, tenant eviction laws are quite strict. The kind of German model, you might think of it. So the state engages and tries to make incentives, market forces to provide housing to as many people as possible. Some scientists say that this is the model where the dominating paradigm is housing as a social right. So the state is thinking about housing as a social right. That's the statist model. But of course, I could talk for hours about this discrimination. Yeah. Okay. So here in the non-commodified model of Central and Eastern Europe, mainly, we can see a decline in the housing gap, but this decline was caused by two factors. First factor, demographic process, the aging of the society, and for most, the decrease in the number of members of households. We had a quite large households after the end of the communist period, and now it's declining. It's becoming more, or it's converging to the standards of Western Europe when it comes to the number of people living in a household. That's the first thing, and the second one is the increase in income. So these are the two factors that drove the housing gap downwards. Then we have also some interesting finding when we look at other the aggregations of the housing gap. Here you have the average for 2010, 2022 for all countries in analysis by type of households. So the composition of the households, and we can see that the housing gap across Europe is lowest for those households without children, especially those that have at least one person over 65, so retired in majority of countries here. The black line denotes the variation for countries and between countries. So you can see the minimum and the maximum value that we obtain for all countries. So it's the lowest here, and those households that have the highest problems are those with many children, especially, and that's the top majority of countries, single parents. Single-parent households have the biggest problem because they have larger housing needs, but there's one earner in that household. But then also large households with 3 or more children right after them. And here we have a very big, also that's very interesting, a very big variation, one of the largest among other groups. One-person households and this typical 2 adults, 2 dependent, 1 dependent children are in the middle. So close to the average for the whole countries in every country. Then I like very much this slide because it draws upon a research that has been at the core of housing affordability studies since Engels, since the 19th century. So whether the Engels law obeys households. And we see similar findings in those of Engels, that in fact, when it comes down to total housing costs and the housing gap and housing affordability, it doesn't drop even if you are in the 5th quintile of the income distribution. So of course, households in the 1st quintile are those households that are most affected by the housing gap. That's true. To some extent, many countries also in the second group. But then group 3, 4, and 5 have values that are statistically insignificantly different from each other. You might say, why so? If you have a household that has one of the highest incomes, the 20% of the highest incomes in the population, it shouldn't have so much housing problems and problems with affordability. But then think of the correlation between the income of the household and the size of the household. So we have here usually larger households. So we have 2 people in it, and mostly if you have higher incomes, you have more children. That's correlation, a rough correlation. I do not want to dig deeper into causality in here, but in general, it's true. So the more income you have, the higher housing needs you have. And these 2 factors go together. Of course, they are not the same problems as you have in the first and second quantile, but still there are some issues, especially if I look from my perspective, Central and Eastern Europe perspective, that you need to tackle. For example, the average size of the flat you build in big cities. It's very hard to rent or buy a flat with 5 rooms at this moment in Warsaw. The house prices were growing, and some supply side rigidities caused that the average size of a newly built home is now 50 square meters, 2, maximum 3 rooms. That's the average. And then if you go into the top segment of 5 rooms, only in very luxurious investment you can find those houses. And those in the, let's say, middle range housing offer, you do not have such large rooms, such large flats in big cities. And that's not only the case of Warsaw. Many cities, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, face the same housing supply problems, which translates into the problems of a housing gap also of those that have the highest incomes that are pushed away from the cities to build their own houses outside of the big cities. And last but not least, in that part of my research, I wanted to show you, that's rather obvious, but still it's worth showing that the data reveals something that we know, that tenants with rented market prices has the highest problems with housing affordability. Housing gap is here the highest, in some countries even above 80%, which is dramatic. And then here we discriminate between those tenants that have the rent-free, which is not only those tenants that are provided by families, but also some tenants that are provided the housing for by the state, which do not need to pay housing costs. In Poland, we have several of them here in this bracket also that are using state aid to satisfy their housing needs. But what is quite interesting, if you compare tenant rent at reduced price with tenant rent at market price, in some countries, for example, Netherlands, the value is higher here. So in some countries do not deliver, speaking frankly. So also those that get some help from the state do not get enough help from the state, and to some extent are stigmatized and also are still in problems with satisfying their housing needs, which many effects that it might cause. You studying here very throughout. Okay, and then the second part of my presentation, so just housing stock distribution. Here, my presentation will be much shorter because the measures are much more let's say, obvious. I do not need to explain them in such detail as before. Here, we try to look at the distribution of the stock of housing among households using various measures. And what we introduced also the analysis of physical measures. So when money is not a good measurement of housing inequality, wealth inequality, then we decided to go for the physical one. So to look at the number of owned residential estates, both houses, purely residential houses, second houses, and we gathered this data together, and we looked, and I like that measure very much, inequality and average living space, which might tell you much more than purely financial measure of gross housing wealth inequality. And we use shares, here we use the Gini index, here we use the Gini index, top 10% share and top 1% share. Oh, and there's one more interesting thing. We try to look at inequality in housing wealth only for owner-occupiers. Because if you have a system like the German or Austrian one, when you have 50% of households living in the rental market, it's pure mathematics that you have a higher value of housing wealth inequality. So it's very interesting to look only on the part of the households that do own at least one house, which also translates how those are different. We use both gross housing wealth, net housing wealth. Here we play around a little bit with only mortgages for housing purchases and construction, so to cut out other housing equity withdrawal tools. But still, the main findings are between those that are here bolded on the slide. So first, the share of households by the number of real estates owned. And there are two things that I would like you to look at the slide. First, of course, the shares. But second, I added it, the average number of residential estates per household. And these two do not correlate too much, which is very interesting. For example, Spain, here in the very middle, has almost 25% of households that do not have any housing equity, but at the very same time has the highest average number of residential estate per household. Why so? Many aspects. First of all, the spatial distribution of housing demand in Spain. For example, the fact that the Spanish interior is underpopulating, so people are moving away from the Spanish interior. But at the very same time, there's a very high demand for investing in houses at the coastal regions. So those wealthy households who invest in the second, third, fourth home in the coastal regions. And some households move to big cities and they do not have any place to live, despite the number of households. This is a very important policy implication I always like to tell to people, policymakers in Poland, that building many houses and giving them away to households doesn't mean that you will tackle the problem of housing affordability. Because you can build as many as they built in Spain over the last 3 decades, but then still 25% of the population doesn't own a house in the environment, in a society that's rather ownership society. It's not a rental society. But
just a quick question on that.
Sure.
Spain obviously is a holiday destination.
Yeah.
And Spanish households no doubt own some additional households on the coast that are rented out to tourists.
Yes.
Are those counted as residential estates or are those commercial?
Yes. Residential. They count as residential. Yeah. If they own a part in a hotel, so-called apart hotels, I know you know we had that in Poland, apart hotels, then no. So discriminated residential from hotels and other commercial estates. But if you think that this data is for 2021, and in 2021 you have a vast amount of offers on Airbnb, these are mainly residential housing units, in fact. Right? Residential housing units that are rented out, yes, but they are not hotels, they are pure residential housing units as they are treated by official statistics. Okay, and then the answer to my initial question and my inspiration about the comparison between Poland and Germany, and what I did expect, we can see here. So if you look at living space inequality, in Poland, we have the highest living space inequality among all those analyzed states, which whereas in Germany, it's much lower. But still, the findings when you look at gross housing wealth in total, of course, in Germany, it's the highest, Poland being somewhere in the lowest regions of the distribution. But then again, if you look at gross housing wealth inequality, when you only analyze owner-occupied households, the whole distribution is flattened out, yeah, from the top and from the bottom. You see that the differences between countries are not that big, which very interesting. What is very interesting, Netherlands, the lowest one when it comes down gross housing wealth inequality only among household owners. So different inequality measures show us different faces of the very same picture. That's what I like to tell you. I do not say that Poland is the country with the highest inequalities when it comes down to housing, but from which angle you look at, you get a different picture. And you need to combine all those pictures together to understand the complexity of the market. And what is very important for the last part of my research, to understand policy recommendations and to address those issues that you face effectively. So, as I'm reaching the end of my time and end of my presentation, just one slide I prepared for you. So the patterns of inequality, a simple dendrogram. So that's the research we are on. So I do not say it's finished. Here, we just put all together all the measures that are presented to you today. So all the various phases of housing inequality, inequality in affordability, inequality of stock distribution. And you do a cluster analysis, simple average linkage cluster analysis with the R2, the similarity measure. And you see here that those variables on a purely mathematical level, they resemble the housing regimes I was talking about. You see here that there is a great divide between East Europe, so Central and Eastern Europe, and the West. So Netherlands, which is a very unique sui generis country, which I always have trouble to assess the certain housing model and housing regime. That's also always a problem for me. Then you see that the statist countries, Germany, France, and Austria, are very close to each other when you look at these variables. Then Portugal, Spain, Ireland, Finland are also one bracket together with Belgium. And then Poland is also a little bit standing out of other Central and Eastern European countries. But these are just the preliminary results. We are working on it to make it more, to tweak up the analysis, but already preliminary findings show us that there are various aspects of housing inequality among European housing regimes. Okay, that's it for me for the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Brilliant, thank you, Adam. So we have about 15 minutes or so for questions.